The first thing you notice about betrayal is how quiet it sounds, like paper tearing underwater, or the soft click of a lock you didn't know existed. I discovered this on a Tuesday morning in October, standing in what used to be our workshop, holding a contract that rewrote my entire life in 12-point Times New Roman. The fog had rolled in thick from the Pacific that morning, the kind that turns our coastal California town into something between dream and memory. Through the salt-stained windows, I could barely make out the shapes of the old Douglas firs that had watched me build this place from nothing. The workshop felt hollow now, like a church after the last prayer has been said. My tools hung on their pegs like artifacts of a life I was still living 24 hours ago. Lucas stood near the bandsaw, his expensive shoes incongruous against the sawdust-covered concrete floor. He wore confidence like cologne, too much of it, filling the space with its cloying presence. In his manicured hands, he held the document that had arrived via courier that morning, sealed with the kind of official weight that changes everything. "I think we both know this is the right move, Thomas." His voice carried that particular tone of manufactured sympathy that consultants perfect, smooth as varnish and just as superficial. "Mara's been carrying more of the operational load these past few years. This just formalizes the reality." The reality. As if our marriage dissolving into legal paperwork was as inevitable as wood grain following its natural split. As if the woman who used to sand pine boards beside me in our garage, humming off-key while we talked about our dreams, had simply evolved into someone who could sign away half of everything we'd built without a phone call, without a conversation, without even the courtesy of looking me in the eye. I set the contract down on my workbench, the same oak surface where I'd sketched the first designs that made us famous, where we'd shared coffee and ambition in equal measure during those early mornings when the world felt malleable as fresh clay. The irony wasn't lost on me that our end was being negotiated over the same surface where our beginning had taken shape. She couldn't tell me herself. The words came out smaller than I intended, absorbed immediately by the workshop's acoustic dampening, years of sawdust settling into every corner, muffling sound like snow. Lucas shifted, and I caught the brief flicker of something that might have been discomfort before his consultant's mask slid back into place. She thought it would be easier this way, less emotional. Less emotional. As if emotion were a design flaw to be engineered out, rather than the raw material from which everything meaningful gets built. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cold glass. Outside, the fog was so thick I couldn't see the parking lot where my truck sat next to Lucas's pristine BMW. Everything beyond 20 feet had been erased, leaving me suspended in this gray limbo between what was and what would be. "The company's grown beyond what either of you imagined," Lucas continued, his voice taking on that pitch he probably used in boardrooms. "We're talking about leveraging existing brand equity, expanding into markets that, frankly, you've been hesitant to explore. Mara sees the potential. She always has. She always has." The phrase hung in the air like sawdust after a rough cut. It was true, in its way. Mara had been the one to push us beyond the garage, to file for the LLC, to court the investors who turned my handmade furniture into what they called a lifestyle brand. She'd been the one to navigate the Byzantine world of distributors and marketing campaigns, while I remained in the workshop, shaping wood into something that might outlast us both. I remembered those early days differently than Lucas's clinical assessment suggested. Mara, in paint-stained jeans, her red hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, working beside me until her hands were raw from sandpaper. The way she'd studied every curve of the rocking chair I'd made for her sister's baby, asking what made the proportions feel right, genuinely curious about the mathematics of beauty. How she'd cry every time we sold a piece in those first months, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that strangers valued what we'd created with our hands. When had that wonder transformed into spreadsheets and market analysis? When had the woman who once traced the grain of walnut with reverent fingers become someone who could discuss leveraging brand equity with the casual fluency of a stranger? "I'll need to review this with my attorney," I said, the words feeling formal and strange in my mouth. 3 years ago, I wouldn't have known the difference between a partnership agreement and a parking ticket. Now I was learning the vocabulary of dissolution. "Of course." Lucas nodded, already reaching for his phone. "Though I should mention, time is somewhat of a factor. The board meets next week, and there are certain opportunities we'd hate to miss." The board. Another word that had crept into our vocabulary like termites in old wood, silent and destructive. What had started as 3 friends sitting around my kitchen table had metastasized into something requiring Robert's rules of order and quarterly projections. After Lucas left, trailing his expensive cologne and implied deadlines, I stood alone in the workshop's cathedral silence. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like the town was holding its breath. I walked to the far corner where Eli worked, bent over a piece of cherry wood, his young hands moving with the patient precision I'd tried to teach him. "You okay, Mr. E?" He looked up from his carving, his dark eyes holding that particular clarity that comes from working with your hands. At 22, Eli possessed something I was still trying to relocate at 42, an unshakable sense of purpose that didn't require external validation. I nodded, though we both knew it was a lie. Eli had that gift that good craftsmen develop, the ability to read the grain of a situation as clearly as the grain in a piece of wood. He knew something fundamental had shifted, just as he'd know if the humidity changed or if someone had used his tools without permission. "Just some business stuff," I said, which was like calling a house fire a heating problem. He returned to his carving, a small bird, wings spread in flight, emerging from the cherry's natural grain. I watched him work, remembering when I'd first shown him how to let the wood tell him what it wanted to become, rather than forcing it into preconceived shapes. His presence here felt like an anchor to something true, something that couldn't be revised or reinterpreted by lawyers and consultants. I'd hired Eli 3 years ago, back when the business was still small enough that I knew every board that came through the door. He'd been 19 then, fresh out of high school, applying for summer work while he figured out his next step. Most young people who wandered into the workshop were looking for quick money, something to pad a college application. But Eli had different hands, hands that understood weight and balance, that could feel the whisper of a dull blade before it started tearing fibers. He'd stayed past that first summer, then through the fall, quietly becoming indispensable in ways that had nothing to do with efficiency or productivity. In a world that was increasingly dominated by metrics and performance indicators, Eli remained focused on the ancient conversation between human intention and natural material. Watching him work was like watching someone pray, the same focused attention, the same humble respect for forces larger than oneself. The drive to Nora Lynn's office took me through the heart of town, past the harbor where fishing boats bobbed like prayer flags in the gray water. The fog had turned everything soft-edged and impressionistic, as if the world were painted in watercolors that hadn't quite dried. This was the weather I'd fallen in love with when Mara and I first moved here 8 years ago. The way the mist could make familiar places feel mysterious, full of possibility. I'd discovered this town by accident, driving up the coast after my father's funeral. He'd been a carpenter too, though he'd never had the luxury of calling himself an artist. His workshop had smelled of sawdust and Marlboros, filled with the practical furniture of necessity rather than beauty. Kitchen cabinets for neighbors, bookshelves for the church, coffins when the town needed them. He taught me to see wood as raw material rather than potential sculpture, to value function over form. It had taken me years to unlearn those lessons, to understand that usefulness and beauty weren't mutually exclusive. That first morning in this coastal town, eating breakfast at a diner overlooking the harbor, I'd sketched a design for a dining table that somehow captured the rhythm of waves against the breakwater. When I'd shown it to Mara that evening, her eyes had lit up with a recognition I'd never seen before. "You see it too," she'd said, though I hadn't known what she meant at the time. Nora's law office occupied the second floor of a Victorian that had been converted into professional suites. The stairs creaked with the particular song of old wood, each step a note in a melody I'd grown to appreciate during my crash course in legal representation. Divorce, I'd learned, was an expensive education in the language of dissolution. Thomas. Nora looked up from her desk as I entered, her expression shifting from professional warmth to something more personal, the look of someone who'd watched a friend navigate rough weather. "I got your message. Coffee?" She poured from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration, handing me a mug that read, "World's Okayest Lawyer," a gift from her teenage daughter, she'd told me once. Nora's office reflected her personality, organized but comfortable, professional but human. Books lined the walls, interspersed with photographs of her family, and a few pieces I'd made during my early days. A small table, a set of bookends carved from driftwood. Nora had been the first person in town to buy something I'd made, back when I was still selling pieces from a booth at the Saturday farmers market. She'd commissioned a desk for her home office, something simple but substantial. I'd spent 2 weeks on it, learning the particular characteristics of the local madrone wood, the way its grain could shift from cream to deep red in the space of a single board. When I'd delivered the desk, she'd run her hands over its surface with the same reverence I'd seen in Mara's face, the recognition of something made with intention rather than manufactured with expedience. She'd paid me twice what I'd asked, insisting that work like mine was worth more than I thought. "You should think about this as a business," she'd said. "The world needs more things made by people who care." Now, 3 years later, I wondered if she regretted that advice. "So," she said, settling back into her chair, "Lucas paid you a visit." It wasn't a question. In a town of 12,000 people, news traveled faster than fog. I handed her the contract, watching her expression shift into what I'd come to recognize as her lawyer face, neutral, analytical, revealing nothing. She read with the kind of attention I brought to grain patterns, looking for the flaws that weren't immediately visible. "This is interesting," she said finally, setting the papers down. "Mara's claiming equal partnership based on a revised operating agreement dated." She flipped through the pages. 6 months ago. 6 months ago. I repeated the words, trying to place them in the timeline of our dissolution. 6 months ago, we were still sharing the same bed, still maintaining the fiction that our marriage was merely going through a rough patch rather than fundamentally cracking along invisible stress lines. "The thing is, Thomas, I don't remember ever seeing this revised agreement, and given that I handled your original incorporation..." She trailed off, reaching for a file cabinet behind her desk. I watched her pull out a thick manila folder, the tab labeled Everhart Furniture Company, in her precise handwriting. The sight of it made something twist in my chest. All those years of building something beautiful, reduced to legal documents and tax forms. "Here's what I want you to do," Nora said, looking up from the folder. "I need you to check your safe at home, the original partnership agreement, the articles of incorporation, anything from those first few months. Bring me everything." The safe. I'd almost forgotten about it, a small fireproof box tucked behind winter coats in our bedroom closet. I'd bought it during those early days when success felt fragile, when I wanted to protect the documents that represented our leap from garage hobby to legitimate business. Mara had teased me about it, calling it my paranoia box, but she'd agreed it was sensible to keep important papers secure. Thomas. Nora's voice pulled me back to the present. I know this is hard. I know it feels like everything you built is being taken apart by strangers. But I need you to remember something. The law cares about documentation, not emotions. If we can establish the chronology, if we can show what was actually agreed to when… She didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. Hope, in legal terms, came down to signatures and dates and witnesses, things that couldn't be reinterpreted or wished away. The house sat on a bluff overlooking the bay, its weathered cedar shingles and large windows designed to capture light and frame the view. I'd sketched the initial plans myself, though we'd hired an architect to make them buildable. Walking up the front path, I noticed things I'd been too numb to see during the past few months. The way the garden had overgrown without Mara's attention, how the front door needed a fresh coat of stain. Inside, the house felt different than it had that morning. Larger, somehow, and quieter. The divorce had left spaces where Mara's presence used to be, empty bookshelves, gaps in the kitchen where her appliances had lived, a peculiar echo in rooms that had once felt full. I climbed the stairs to what had been our bedroom, now just mine, and opened the closet. Behind the row of winter coats that rarely got worn in our mild climate, the safe sat exactly where I'd left it 3 years ago. The combination felt foreign under my fingers. 03/17/15. March 17th, 2015. The day we'd officially incorporated. The safe opened with a soft click, revealing documents I hadn't seen in years. And there, at the bottom, sealed in a plastic sleeve, the original partnership agreement. I pulled it out with hands that had started to shake slightly. The document was exactly as I remembered. Simple, clear, bearing both our signatures and the date. March 15th, 2015. But what made my breath catch wasn't the date or the signatures. It was the language itself. Thomas James Everhart shall maintain full ownership and creative control of Everhart Furniture Company. Mara Sinclair. Everhart shall serve as business manager, with compensation to be determined quarterly based on company performance, but shall hold no ownership stake in the company assets, intellectual property, or future business ventures. Full ownership. No ownership stake. The phrases seemed to pulse on the page. I sealed the document back and closed the safe, the combination numbers feeling significant now, not just a date, but a demarcation line between before and after. Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing patches of the bay in sharp detail. Standing at the bedroom window, holding the original contract, I felt something shift inside me. Not triumph, that would come later, if at all. Not even relief. What I felt was a strange kind of clarity, like looking at a piece of wood and suddenly seeing exactly where the grain wanted to split. The workshop would still be there when I returned, filled with the patient presence of unfinished projects and the smell of sawdust and linseed oil. Eli would still be there, carving his small bird from cherry wood, teaching me by example that the most important things couldn't be taken away by contracts or boardroom meetings. But first, there was a phone call to make, and a document to deliver, and a truth to establish that had been buried under years of revision and reinterpretation. I walked downstairs, the original contract tucked safely in my jacket pocket, and dialed Nora's number. Outside, the afternoon sun had burned through the last of the fog, revealing the familiar landscape in sharp, unforgiving detail. The afternoon sun streaming through Nora's office windows felt different this time. Sharper, more defined, like the fog had taken uncertainty with it when it lifted. I sat across from her desk, the original contract spread between us like a map to territory I wasn't sure I wanted to reclaim. "It's ironclad," Nora said, her finger tracing the signatures at the bottom of the page. Witnessed, notarized, filed with the state. Lucas's revised agreement doesn't supersede this. It's legally meaningless. I stared at the document, at Mara's signature flowing across the page in the confident loops I'd once found beautiful. She'd signed this willingly, even eagerly, back when our dreams were aligned and the future felt like something we were building together rather than something that might be taken away. So I win. The words felt strange in my mouth, hollow despite their legal weight. Nora leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the attention she usually reserved for contracts. You can win everything back, Thomas. Full control, full ownership. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. I waited, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. What does winning look like to you? Because I've seen people destroy themselves proving they were right. The law can give you justice, but it can't give you peace. Those are two different things. That evening, I found myself walking through the old part of town, past the lumber yard where I'd bought my first sheets of plywood, past the weathered buildings that had housed 3 generations of fishing families. The fog was rolling in again, softer this time, like the day was gently surrendering to night. I ended up at the harbor, watching boats return from their day on the water. There was something honest about their purpose. Go out, bring back fish, come home. No board meetings or market analysis required, just the ancient rhythm of need and fulfillment. My phone buzzed. Mara's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I felt the old muscle memory of affection before remembering why that was dangerous now. Thomas? Her voice carried across the distance between us like fog, intimate and obscuring at the same time. Lucas said you two talked today. We did. A pause. In the background, I could hear the sound of traffic, which meant she was calling from the city apartment she'd moved to after our separation. The noise felt alien after months of coastal quiet. I suppose you think I'm terrible, she said finally. The honest answer was complicated. Terrible implied intention to harm, and I didn't think Mara had woken up one morning deciding to destroy what we'd built. She'd simply convinced herself that she deserved something that was never hers to claim. I think you're scared, I said instead. Another pause. Then, of what? Of being forgotten. Of all this meaning, nothing if your name isn't on the ownership papers. Maybe. Her voice got smaller. You always made it look so easy, Thomas. Creating something beautiful and not caring who got credit. But I spent 3 years building this business alongside you, and when people talk about Everhart Furniture, they talk about your vision, your craftsmanship, like I was just administrative support. I could hear the hurt beneath her words, the fear that she'd invested years of her life in something that would write her out of its history. But understanding her pain didn't excuse the betrayal. Empathy wasn't the same as absolution. You could have talked to me, I said. We could have figured something out. Could we? Really? When was the last time we had a conversation about the business that didn't end with you shutting down, going back to your workshop to think things through alone? The accusation stung because it held enough truth to draw blood. I had retreated, had used the workshop as a refuge when our marriage started feeling like a negotiation rather than a partnership. But retreat wasn't the same as abandonment. I need you to withdraw the revised agreement, I said. I can't do that. You can. You just don't want to. The call ended with the particular silence that comes after words that can't be taken back. I stood at the harbor's edge, watching fog swallow the last boats coming in, and realized that some distances couldn't be bridged by understanding or forgiveness. Some things, once broken, stayed broken no matter how carefully you tried to piece them back together. The next morning, I arrived at the workshop early, before Eli, before the town fully woke up. I needed the solitude, the familiar weight of tools in my hands, the meditative repetition of work that had sustained me through every crisis I'd faced. I selected a piece of maple from the lumber rack, pale, fine-grained, patient. Sitting at my workbench, I began sketching a design for a small chair, something simple but perfectly proportioned. Child-sized. The curves came naturally, flowing from pencil to paper, like water finding its course. When Eli arrived an hour later, I was already shaping the seat, feeling the wood respond to the pressure of my hands. Starting something new? He settled at his own bench, continuing work on the cherry bird that seemed to grow more lifelike each day. "A gift," I said. "For your niece." He looked up, surprised. "How did you know Sarah was pregnant?" "You've been carving a bird for 3 weeks. You only work that carefully on something that matters." We worked in comfortable silence, the workshop filling with the gentle sounds of creation, the whisper of sandpaper, the soft percussion of mallet against chisel. This was what I'd been trying to protect all along, I realized. Not the business or the brand or the market share, but this. The quiet conversation between intention and material, the alchemy of turning raw wood into something that might outlast us both. Around noon, Lucas appeared at the workshop door, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the sawdust and work clothes. Behind him stood 2 men I didn't recognize, lawyers by the look of them, carrying briefcases and the particular tension of people accustomed to conflict. "Thomas." Lucas's voice carried a new edge, the manufactured sympathy replaced by something harder. "I think we need to have a more formal conversation about the company's future." I set down my sandpaper and looked at him across the workbench where Mara and I had once planned our dreams. "I think you're right." "Good. Then you'll be reasonable about this transition. The board has already approved the new structure, and frankly, fighting it will only cost everyone money we don't need to spend." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the original contract, setting it on the workbench between us. "You mean this transition?" Lucas glanced at the document, his expression shifting as he recognized what he was seeing. One of the lawyers stepped forward, scanning the pages with professional speed. "This predates our agreement," Lucas said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "By 6 months," I said. "Witnessed, notarized, legally binding. Your agreement, if we can call something that was never actually agreed to an agreement, is worth exactly nothing." The lawyer whispered something to Lucas, who straightened his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. "We'll need to review this." "You do that." I picked up my sandpaper and returned to the chair, dismissing them with the simple act of continuing my work. "But do it somewhere else. This is still my workshop." After they left, Eli looked up from his carving. "You going to fight them?" I considered the question, running my thumb along the smooth curve of the chair's arm. "I'm going to protect what matters." That afternoon, I called Nora and scheduled a meeting for the following week, not to plan an attack, but to determine the terms of surrender. Theirs, not mine. I had the law on my side now, but more importantly, I had clarity about what I was fighting for. It wasn't revenge I wanted, or even justice in the traditional sense. It was the right to continue creating without interference, to work with my hands in a place that understood the value of patience and care. The right to teach young people like Eli that some things couldn't be leveraged or optimized or disrupted. They could only be honored. As evening fell and the fog began its nightly return, I put the finishing touches on the small chair. It wasn't perfect. Perfection was for machines. But it was true to its purpose, built to last, made with the kind of attention that turns wood into something approaching grace. Tomorrow, there would be boardrooms and lawyers, and the careful choreography of legal resolution. But tonight, there was just this. The weight of honest work in my hands, the smell of sawdust and possibility, and the quiet satisfaction of having finally chosen to fight for something worth defending. The boardroom smelled of industrial carpet and recycled air, fluorescent lights humming overhead like trapped insects. I'd never liked this place, too sterile, too removed from the honest smell of wood and oil that grounded my work. But here we were, 5 years of building something beautiful, reduced to a conference table and uncomfortable chairs. Mara sat across from me, her hands folded on the table's polished surface. She looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by the formal setting in a way that surprised me. Lucas flanked her right side, his lawyer beside him, both men wearing expressions of barely concealed irritation. At the head of the table, the 3 silent investors who'd helped us grow from garage hobby to legitimate business watched with the patient attention of people accustomed to other people's drama. Nora sat to my left, the original contract in a manila folder before her. She'd insisted on bringing copies for everyone, though I suspected most of the room already knew what we'd found. "Thank you all for coming," said Margaret Chen, the lead investor and nominal board chair. Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who'd navigated corporate disputes before. "I understand there are some questions about the company's ownership structure." Lucas cleared his throat, launching into what sounded like a prepared statement about good faith negotiations and mutual benefit. I stopped listening after the first sentence. Instead, I found myself studying Mara's face, looking for traces of the woman who used to hum while sanding wood, who'd cry tears of joy when strangers bought our creations. She must have felt my attention because she looked up, and for a moment our eyes met across the table. In hers, I saw something I hadn't expected, not defiance or guilt, but a hollow kind of defeat, as if she'd already realized how this would end. "Thomas?" Margaret's voice pulled me back to the present. "Would you like to respond to Lucas's proposal?" I looked around the table at these people who thought they understood what we'd built. The investors saw profit margins and market expansion. Lucas saw leverageable assets and optimization opportunities. Even Mara, I realized now, had begun seeing the business as a thing to be owned rather than a thing to be tended. "No," I said quietly. "I don't think I would." Nora opened her folder and began distributing copies of the original contract. The room fell silent except for the rustle of paper and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights. I watched faces change as people read, Lucas's jaw tightening, his lawyer's eyebrows rising, the investors exchanging glances that spoke in the shorthand of calculated risk. "This is dated March 15th, 2015, Nora said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of facts. 2 days before incorporation, witnessed by myself and notarized by the state. It clearly establishes Thomas Everhart as sole owner of the company, with Mara Sinclair Everhart serving as compensated business manager without ownership stake." Lucas's lawyer leaned forward. "The revised agreement we submitted reflects the current reality of the business relationship." "The revised agreement," Nora interrupted, "was never signed by my client and therefore has no legal standing. This document supersedes any subsequent claims to ownership." The room erupted in the kind of controlled chaos that lawyers call negotiation. Whispered conferences, pointed questions about dates and signatures, the careful parsing of language that turns human relationships into legal precedent. Through it all, Mara sat in silence, staring at the contract that she'd signed willingly 5 years ago when love felt like enough protection against an uncertain future. Finally, Margaret raised her hand for quiet. "The original contract appears to be legally binding. The question now is how we move forward." Lucas straightened in his chair, regaining some of his composure. "Thomas, be reasonable. You can't run this company alone. The market demands—" "I'm not interested in what the market demands," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice. I'm interested in what I built and why I built it. I stood up, needing distance from the table and its weight of accumulated grievances. Walking to the window, I looked out at the harbor where fog was beginning its afternoon advance, softening the edges of familiar buildings. I started this business because I wanted to make beautiful things that would last, I said, speaking to the window as much as to the room. Things made with patience and care, things that carried some trace of human intention. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. I turned back to face the room. Mara, you helped me build something extraordinary, but what you're trying to claim now isn't what we built together. It's what other people convinced you we should build instead. Her composure finally cracked. I spent 3 years of my life. I know. I kept my voice gentle, remembering the woman who traced wood grain with reverent fingers. And I'm grateful for that. But gratitude isn't the same as ownership, and partnership isn't the same as possession. The silence that followed felt different than the earlier tension, less legal maneuvering, more recognition of something ending. Margaret cleared her throat. What are you proposing, Thomas? I returned to my seat, pulling a folder from my jacket. Inside were documents Nora and I had prepared the night before, papers that had required no lawyers or negotiations, just a clear understanding of what mattered. I'm proposing to buy out everyone's interest in Everhart Furniture Company, I said, distributing the papers. At fair market value, based on independent appraisal. Lucas scanned the documents, his face reddening. This is insulting. The company's worth 10 times this amount. The company as you envision it might be, I said, but I'm not selling the company you want to build. I'm buying back the company I already built. I explained my proposal calmly, watching faces process the implications. I would retain full ownership and creative control, continuing to operate from the coastal workshop with a focus on handcrafted, limited production pieces. The investors would receive their initial investment plus modest returns. Lucas would receive nothing, since he'd never actually owned anything to begin with. And Mara, I'm offering you 18 months severance, I said, looking directly at her. Plus, the opportunity to keep any pieces you've personally selected from our catalog. I think that's fair compensation for your contributions. Her laugh held no humor. You think 3 years of my life is worth 18 months' salary? I think 3 years of your life is worth whatever meaning you found in it, I said. But I can't pay you in ownership for something you never owned. The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, lawyers conferring, investors calculating, Lucas making phone calls that grew increasingly agitated. Through it all, Mara sat quietly, occasionally glancing at the original contract as if it might change under sustained attention. Finally, she spoke. I never understood why you kept that safe. I kept it because I knew someday we might need to remember what we actually agreed to, I said. Not what we wished we'd agreed to, or what seemed fair in hindsight, but what we actually chose when we had clearer vision. One by one, the parties accepted my buyout terms. The investors had gotten their money's worth and saw no profit in extended litigation. Lucas's lawyer advised him that fighting the original contract would be expensive and futile. In the end, only Mara held out, staring at papers that would dissolve her legal connection to everything we'd built. Sign it, Lucas urged her. We'll start something new, something better. But I could see in her face that she finally understood what she was letting go. Not just a business, but the last tangible connection to a time when we'd shared the same dreams, when the future felt like something we were carving together from raw possibility. She signed with the same flowing script that had graced the original contract, though her hand shook slightly as she formed the letters of her name. After the papers were filed and the lawyers dispersed, I found myself alone in the parking lot with Mara. The fog had rolled in while we negotiated our ending, turning the familiar landscape soft and impressionistic. "I hope you get what you're looking for," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "I already have it," I replied. "I just forgot for a while." She got into Lucas's BMW without another word, and I watched them drive away into the fog, carrying their plans for optimization and market expansion to whatever sterile office space would house their next venture. I drove home slowly, taking the coast road that wound past tide pools and cypress groves, breathing salt air and the particular freedom that comes from choosing authenticity over opportunity. The workshop waited for me, unchanged despite all the legal drama, tools on their pegs, projects in various stages of completion, the patient presence of unfinished work. Eli looked up from his bench as I entered, the cherry bird nearly complete in his hands. He didn't ask about the meeting. He could read the outcome in my posture, in the way I moved through the space with renewed ownership. "The chair's beautiful," he said, nodding toward the small piece I'd finished the night before. "Sarah's going to love it." I picked up the chair, running my fingers over its smooth surfaces, feeling the grain of the maple through layers of careful sanding. It wasn't perfect, no handmade thing ever was, but it carried something that perfection couldn't, the trace of human intention, the evidence of care. "Want to help me deliver it?" I asked. Together, we carried the chair to Eli's truck, the fog parting around us like a benediction. As we drove toward town, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, not triumph or vindication, but the quiet satisfaction of having finally remembered what I was protecting and why it mattered. The workshop would be there when we returned, filled with the honest smell of wood and possibility. Tomorrow there would be new projects to begin, young craftspeople to teach, beautiful things to coax from raw material. The business I'd reclaimed was smaller than what others had envisioned, but it was wholly mine again, rooted in values that couldn't be leveraged or optimized away. In the side mirror, I watched the fog swallow the road behind us, erasing our path while revealing new territory ahead. The original line, the true foundation of everything I'd built, remained intact, ready to support whatever came next.